So we have before us this morning a story that is, without a doubt, the most famous of all the Elijah stories in the Bible. You know, when you think of Noah, you think about the flood. When you think of Joshua, you think of Jericho. When you think of David, you think of Goliath. When you think of Daniel, you think of the lion's den. And for most people, when they think of Elijah, the first thing that comes to mind is this amazing encounter with the prophets of Baal. It's just a great story. It's an amazing story. And because of that, you would think that this would be an easy text to preach on. But it's really not. Because what am I supposed to do with this? I mean, I cannot guarantee you that God will ever do something quite like this for you. I mean, certainly God could bring a fire down from heaven again. If he did it before, he can do it again. He can do anything, right? But the question is not can he, but will he? You see, one of the reasons why this story stands out so much is precisely because of its rarity. In fact, there's actually another place in the Gospels where the disciples of Jesus ask Jesus to do this again, and he immediately shuts them down. Luke 9 says this. It says, he, Jesus, sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Now, the text doesn't say, but you can be pretty certain that the disciples were thinking of this encounter between Elijah and the prophets of Baal when they made that request. But Jesus says, no, we're not going to go around torching people. That's not the point. So whatever we do with this text from 1 Kings today, my sermon title can't be 5 Easy Steps to Calling Down Fire from Heaven. That's not the preachable point of this story. So what is? Well, as I've looked at it and pondered this amazing story, I think the preachable point for today is contained in verse 21. It says this. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. You see here, Elijah is calling for commitment. Right? No more riding the fence on this one. It's time to make a choice. Whose side are you on? Are you on the Lord's side or are you on Baal's side? Now, Baal was the false god of the Canaanites, the idol that they worshiped. And the people apparently did not like this question being posed to them. Because the very next line says, but the people said nothing. Elijah's world, in other words, was a whole lot like our world. You know, if you want to get yourself labeled narrow-minded and a right-wing extremist in our day, one of the best things you can say is that you believe Christianity is the one true religion. There's probably no other verse in the Bible that modern people outside of our faith struggle with more than this one. John 14, verse 6. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Not one way, not a good way, not even the best way. I am the way and the truth and the only way to find life. And oh man, people do not like to hear that in our day. People today tend to think more like this. These are a couple of recent quotes I found from some young adults in New York City who are not Christians. Okay? One said this. Can we bring up the quote there? How could there be just one true faith? It's arrogant to say your religion is superior and try to convert everyone else to it. Surely all the religions are equally good and valid for meeting the needs of their particular followers. Another said this, religious exclusivity is not just narrow, it's dangerous. If Christians continue to insist that they have the truth, and if other religions do this as well, the world will never know peace. These are very common points of view in our day, and apparently in Elijah's time also. But it's not what Elijah believed. And more importantly, it's not what Jesus taught. So how do we, as followers of Jesus, respond to that? Well, I want to offer a response to you today by addressing 3 questions. And here they are. First, why do we need to make a choice at all? Second, how do you recognize a false God? And third, how do you recognize the one true God? Okay, so that's kind of our outline for today. These 3 things. Why do we need to make a choice at all? How do you recognize a false God? And how do you recognize the one true God? First, let's talk about why do we need to make a choice at all? Why can't we just borrow a little from Christianity and a little from Buddhism and something else, create a faith that is particularly tailored to our specific desires? Or why can't we just say that all religions are equally good and helpful and right? And Elijah's answer is that you can't say that, because if you say that, you're just not being intellectually honest. There's a great word that Elijah is using in his famous question that gets a little lost in translation. Elijah asked this, how long will you waver between 2 opinions? But the word waver isn't really the best translation, and here's why. Here's another verse from the Old Testament that uses that same word. 2 Samuel 9, verse 13 says this, and Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. Now, the word translated crippled here is the same word that Elijah is using for wavering. The ESV translation is a little better at capturing this nuance. It translates Elijah's question like this. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between 2 opinions? Elijah's saying, in other words, that their seemingly less exclusive position that they think is so open-minded is actually hurting them more. It's crippling them. You can believe in the one true God, or you can reject the one true God, but the worst thing, the most crippling thing of all, is not even to reject him, but to hold this middle ground position. And why? Because it's not being intellectually honest. And here's what I mean by that. Some of you may know there's an old illustration that's sometimes used of a mountain with many different roads, all of which lead to the top. But you can't see that when you're on the roads themselves. All you can see is the little bit of road in front of you. And so the people on one road are saying to the people on the other road, hey, you're going the wrong way. Right? This is the right road. This is the road that takes you to the top of the mountain. You got to follow us. And the people on the other road are shouting back, no, you're on the wrong road. This is the road that leads to the top. You need to follow us. And the people on the various roads represent the different religions, all thinking that they alone are on the right path to truth and to God and to life eternal. But do you see the problem? The only way you could know that is if you see the whole mountain. So, in other words, if you say all religions are equally valid, that's not any more open-minded or less narrow of a position. That's just as much of an exclusive claim as saying Jesus is the only way. Because by saying all religions are equally true, you are claiming that you have superior spiritual knowledge to everyone else who says Jesus is the only way. So how is that any less narrow? See, the truth is we're all exclusive in our beliefs. We're just exclusive about different things. So if you think, well, those people are being narrow-minded, but I'm not, that's just intellectually dishonest. And so the answer can't be to say that all beliefs must be equally valid. The answer is to compare them. And that leads us to point 2, which is, how do you recognize a false god? And your first response when you read this text is to say, well, you can recognize that Baal is false because the fire doesn't fall from heaven. Right? The prophets of Baal pray their prayers, and their prayers don't work. But when Elijah prays his prayers, stuff happens. And so therefore, Elijah's God is real and Baal is false. And that's true, but we got to be very careful here. Because as we said at the beginning, we know that even the one true God does not always do things like this. I mean, what if we gathered up today after church and we all prayed fervently that God would bring down fire from heaven again? What if we gathered together and we prayed and asked him to torch our field across the street to prove to our community that he's real? If it didn't happen, does that mean that our God is false too? Of course not. It just means God didn't want to do that. Likewise, if a Christian prays for someone that they love to be healed, say, of cancer, and the person isn't healed and they die, does that mean God's not real? Of course not. It just means that's not what God's plan was for that person at that time. And so we can't just say lack of results is the mark of a false God, even though it clearly is in this story. We have to see that the sign of a false God is revealed in this story before their prayers don't work. And that starts in verse 26. It says this: they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. And so Elijah then taunts them, right? Now, what is your God asleep? Is he deep in thought? What's the problem here? And then it says this: so they shouted louder, slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Do you see the growing intensity here? First they pray, then they shout, then they dance, then they shout louder, and finally they start slashing themselves. This is the sign of a false god. With a false god, our role is to go before them and perform. Our job is to impress them in the hopes that if we impress them, they will do something for us that we want. But you see, false gods always demand more and more of us while they give us less and less until ultimately they demand everything and give us nothing. False gods always make us slash ourselves. The only difference is that today we slash ourselves in different ways than they did. Sometimes our false god is our job. Now, nothing wrong with having a job, right? It's a good thing to work and be productive and contribute and all of that. But if we're not careful, our jobs can easily become false gods that demand more and more and more of us. And so we work more and more hours, and we neglect our health, and we neglect our families, and we bring work home with us so we can work even more when we're allegedly off work. And oftentimes, no one is asking us to do this. We do this to ourselves. We slash ourselves in an attempt to perform and impress and get something that never ever comes. But of course, it doesn't have to be a job. It can be the opposite, right? Health, even, can be a false god. I mean, again, nothing wrong with trying to be healthy. We should all try to eat well and exercise, avoid things that hurt our health and all of that. But if we're not careful, even our health can become a false god that demands more and more and more of us. We see it in diets that develop into eating disorders. We see it in the depression that comes to many young women who obsess over their body image. We see it in the people who always have time to go on another run or another round of golf, but never find time for their spouse or their kids. See, there are all kinds of ways that we can slash ourselves. Because just like then, there's a lot of Baals out there. And that is how we recognize them. But now, how do we recognize the one true God? Well, take a look at verse 36 with me. Elijah builds his altar, he pours all this water on it, and then comes this. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Now, did you notice how much calmer Elijah is than the prophets of Baal? Elijah doesn't shout. Elijah doesn't dance. And Elijah certainly does not slash himself. And that is the sign of the one true God. It's not just that the fire fell for Elijah and not for the prophets of Baal, because sometimes the fire doesn't fall for us either. Just ask the disciples. The evidence of the one true God is found in Elijah's demeanor. He's calm and at peace and confident no matter what happens next. Because you see, he knows he does not have to perform for his God. He knows he doesn't have to do anything to impress his God. Because the one true God doesn't make us slash ourselves in order to get stuff. Every other God in the world says, you slash yourself for me. But the one true God says, no, I will slash myself for you. In Luke 9, the disciples asked Jesus if he would bring down fire from heaven on the Samaritans, and he said no. But just a little later, in Luke's gospel, he told them this: I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it is completed. Now, what's he talking about? He's talking about the cross. Jesus says he didn't come to put on a big show or do tricks or call down literal fire from heaven like Elijah. But the fire of God's wrath over the sin and failure and rebellion of us all was going to fall very soon. But it was not going to fall on us. It was going to fall on him. And it did. And because it did, We do not need to perform or attempt to impress God in order to get his attention. We don't need to put on a big show to convince him to help us. We don't need to worry and stress as if this all depends on us. We don't need to slash ourselves. We can live in peace and confidence and hope and joy because he slashed himself for us, and he is taking care of everything. No other God has ever done something like that. And that's why God asks us this question today. How long will you go on limping? If the Lord is God, follow him. Let's bow our heads and pray.